welcome, folks. Today we have with us Michael Armentor. Michael has been researching the 1933 Magenta, Italy UFO crash retrieval case. Some of you may have heard of this. Some of you may never have heard of this. Michael, what I'm going to do is, to get us started here, is I'm just going to give a concise overview of my understanding of having read a little bit into it, and then pass it to you to clear anything up, or then sort of we'll expand from there.
Cool. Sounds good.
All right. So this topic, the 1933 UFO crash in Italy, Magenta, first comes up in the 90s, and it is a anonymous document dump. A batch of documents show up at a researcher, Roberto Pinotti's house. And this is where the documents come from that speak of a crash of an unknown vehicle aircraft in Italy's territory. And then another document showing a sketch of a sighting by I believe the Italian Air Force of a sort of disc-shaped, UFO-shaped. This is where this information begins. Now, we're going to get into the details of it here with Michael. The documents are proven forensically, actually paper and ink from the 1930s, which is kind of interesting to this case. But what I would like to start with, actually, is looking at where this originates with Roberto Pinotti. I did a little bit of research into him, and I found that he was actually an intelligence officer in the Italian Air Force. I believe that's the information I had, so you can correct me if I'm wrong there. My first question, I guess, is have you done a deeper dive on Roberto Pinotti and this whole phenomenon of him receiving these documents that begins the story in the modern era of the 1933 Italy UFO crash?
Absolutely. And because he is absolutely central to the story, and in a really fascinating way, actually. It's pretty much all of the major developments about the case and his work and his research associated with those documents are seminal as far as the case goes. And, as far as I'm concerned, he is the major and main researcher and contributor to the 1933 case overall. I essentially don't have any research or anything to really connect to without his work, is a really good way to put it. And that's kind of how, and that's also kind of maybe the reason why the evidence is contested as well. I believe, and I'm still clarifying on this point, we're still learning, but I believe that he has ownership of the documents, and he hasn't really allowed for like a third party review. Some people claim that may not be true, because we just don't have necessarily the most updated information on that yet. But it's enough intrigue that as I've examined it along the way, it's very clear to me that one thing is clear, that, Roberto Pinotti is not always right, but he is always working in good faith to further the UFO topic. He genuinely believes that this is a really important topic that affects all of humanity, transcends borders, and just he treats it with the importance that it deserves. And so all of his research is flavored with that. And, he's provided enough, now information about the possibility of who gave him the documents that we can actually probably historically trace those documents all the way back to their source. And that's kind of where I came in, because I was like, the big question around is the provenance. Where did these documents come from? How did they get to Pinotti?
Why? And what have you found so far on that question?
So, and this is from Roberto Pinotti himself. He's claimed that he believes that the documents originated from and came from a member of the Ciano family, which there was Etta Ciano and Galeazzo Ciano. And Etta Ciano was Mussolini's daughter. And in 1930, Galeazzo had married her, kind of making him an elevated position in the fascist regime, because he was essentially Mussolini's son-in-law.
And for those who maybe are not brushed up on their world history, Mussolini was the dictator of Italy during World War II and before.
Right. He had come to power in the 1920s, the Black Shirt Brigade in Rome. And, that's how he was absolutely an authoritarian fascist dictator in Italy that was actively consolidating all of Italy's cultural and financial mechanisms under one umbrella of fascism.
And they were allied to Nazi Germany during the
So
war.
actually, it's a little bit of a misconception that they were, so around 1933 in particular, they were not as closely allied with Germany as they were later on.
During the war, yeah. Before,
during the
not.
war. And, and it's actually really interesting that connection between the Italians and the Germans really only strengthened in the very late 30s. Like in the early 30s, they were still very suspicious of each other. And in fact, in 1934, Mussolini diverted troops in, I can't remember if it was Austria or Poland, to essentially block German troops that were kind of, already kind of encroaching on that area. And there was a little bit of a standoff there. And because at the time, and there's another really interesting fact about the 1933 case, shortly after it's alleged that it happened, Italo Balbo, Italy's I forget what they call it, but the airplane minister, he was like the leader of the Air Force in Italy. He made one of the first transatlantic flights to Chicago shortly after the crash was alleged to happen. And, it was obviously a huge reception in Chicago, huge fanfare. They named a street after him in downtown Chicago, and had this whole big ceremony. And then he went on to New York to meet with Nelson Rockefeller in order to, basically pitch to the American elite to invest in Italy's, airplane research. And kind of like other things, and which is kind of I've postulated that it's certainly possible that the crash happened, and that on a fact-finding mission / money-finding mission, they went to America to be like, hey, do you know what this is / do you want to fund us to figure it out?
Sure. So what date did he fly then to America, and how far away was it from the crash?
So well, he left from Rome, and it was later that same year, so like August, and kind of like so like a couple months after the crash.
Couple months, okay, that's a good time frame. That makes sense for something
right,
like that.
And it wasn't like immediately after or anything,
right?
And it was also, and also I will say too that it was something that was absolutely in the works before the crash. Like it was something that was being planned. Obviously, it was a huge logistic.
The visit to the U.S.
Right. Yeah, the transatlantic flight specifically, because it was it was a huge logistical thing at the time to get a bunch of essentially fighter jets, and they weren't jets at the time, they were propeller based, but across the Atlantic Ocean. They even lost a pilot on the way.
Oh, wow.
So, it was like at the time that was like they were displaying their powers. Absolutely.
Right. So that's interesting, but the fact that they were planning it for a long time, it's sort of, more of a coincidence. But like you said, it could be possible that even if he was scheduled to go there a couple months after the crash, that he would have mentioned it at that point, possibly.
Right.
And someone like Rockefeller, or what's interesting too is Chicago, obviously a big headquarters of the mafia, and so you wonder, and I've always wondered from time to time, organized crime and what kind of hand they've got in the behind the scenes, UFO topic. Certainly, if there's if it's at that level of the military industrial complex, there's some sort of crossover point for sure.
There's absolutely precedent for that. Paul Helliwell and all that. I don't know how much you ever heard of Paul Helliwell?
Helliwell?
Paul Helliwell?
Not Hellier.
No, not Hellier. Helliwell.
Yeah, Helliwell. No, have not.
Super interesting historical figure. It obviously would be a little bit of a tangent to get into him right now, but I would highly recommend looking into Paul Helliwell for that kind of organized crime overlap, because there's a very, very well established historical precedent for that type of activity, I'd say.
Great. So, all right, let's come back to the documents.
Right. So
my understanding, and can you just elucidate further on what we need to know? There was classified telegrams that were coming from Air Force Command to Mussolini or whatever in the high chain of command, saying, and I believe it was quoted as, and we could maybe, I want to sort of get into the description of the craft. My memory was that it was quoted as very up for interpretation as something like unknown aerial vehicle. So where does the idea that it was disc-shaped or something truly exotic, where does that come in? Is that in those first documents somewhere?
So
about the
no, it
crash
is not.
specifically, right?
It
Okay.
is not in the documents, and that is a huge hurdle here. And so that is a critical piece of this, is that the documents themselves strictly cover a unidentified crash, and then the protocols to cover it up, which are stringent.
Okay.
And so we know that for a fact, that it was a matter of extremely high security, and for the highest of command, but not necessarily Mussolini himself. My very strong hypothesis right now is that these documents were included in the personal collection of Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's kind of second in command, and that he may have been the one that kind of, initially collected these documents and attempted to use them as political leverage for himself. So naturally, the next question would be: Is there any evidence of the record of Ciano doing that? And absolutely. I mean, it's a core element of his story. It's something called the Ciano diaries.
All right, so let's. I want to get into clarifying that
Yeah.
in a little while. The Ciano diaries. I remember you talking about that.
Yeah, and it is complicated how it connects to the documents, but once you kind of make that connection, it's very clear how these documents could be directly connected to Ciano.
Okay, so before we go back to that, the documents themselves. Are there any more descriptions of what the craft looked like, when, where it crashed, or was it just then that one page I think I remember that says unknown aircraft crashed? Is there anything else to give us more detail?
There's literally 2 pages, I think, 2 or 3 pages, as far as I'm concerned, about those specific details, and and to kind of.
So how do we know that it was unusual beyond, like, I don't know, just a plane or something?
So now that's where Roberto Pinotti comes in again, because over the years he has added vast amounts of chains of circumstantial evidence for the existence of RS-33, which is the special counsel that did it. He's gotten separated and disconnected testimony about that. He's gotten claims about people who've seen the craft and people who were around the recovery. He's done all these kind of investigative things, going around Italy and writing books. This is in a lot of his books, and it's kind of difficult to relay a lot of this information because a lot of them are in Italian and not properly translated right now.
Right.
So
would it be fair to say, and sorry to cut you off for a second, but
no, it's okay.
Would it be fair to say that what makes the connection between that 33 document about the craft of the unknown, it does say unknown, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, an unknown aircraft. So that narrows it down a little bit. And that between something like a flying saucer is because there's another, and this is an authentic document in that same batch of a drawing of a sighting by the Italian Air Force of something disc-shaped, something cigar-shaped. Is that correct? And
so
so
I
that
believe
connection has
cigar
been like,
shaped, but not quite disc shaped. And there's a couple drawings, and
it's anomalous, right? It's not something that they would have expected, right?
Right. And
Like
in
a UFO.
In the whole category, and you read these whole reports, and it's actually a really interesting, it's crafted in an interesting way, because it demonstrates aerial sightings in multiple places in the country, for one. It demonstrates the stringent and off telegram security protocols that were implemented around a crash in 1933. It specifically kind of mentions the need for the telegram to be an extra sensitive level or destroyed after reading, or so on and so forth. So it's a minimal look, but it's just enough that there is a little bit of light between the cracks there.
Right.
It's difficult to discern, but when you have more context about how the Italian fascists operated, it's really not surprising that they wouldn't put a ton about this on paper in the first place, because they already operated with a very stringent level of security and secrecy within their internal organization that had allowed them to flourish in previous years.
Sure.
And so those were all kind of well-established mechanisms, I guess.
Sure. And that's something that I think we always have to be mindful of, is the most sensitive secret, top secret, above top secret. That's like of that era's version of a skiff, right? Yeah. Those aren't in memos, even, secret or top secret documents, that you're still not getting the highest
Well, right,
thing
and
that was known. It was verbally, or it was destroy after reading. Yes.
well, right, because like everybody knew it was basic tradecraft that if you're gonna have stuff on paper, if somebody you don't want reading it reads it, you're screwed. It's
Right.
that simple.
And then you get into the mind games of how many times were they knowing that there was a mole or spy. So let's make this document. So it's tough work. You
Yeah.
gotta the bigger patterns in the corroboration is important.
Well, and that's also what's interesting about it too, is that it's a series of documents over time. And so it suggests that someone had a position where they had access to a corpus of these documents, and that this was maybe perhaps part of a larger collection, because there's no guarantee that what Pinotti got was all the documents.
Sure.
And that's also, I mean, as far as he knows, that's all the documents that exist, but that's not something that's for sure.
I wanted to clear that up with you because I swear one of the articles I read when he was writing, and I think he had a partner too, there was reference made to they having received other documents over the years. And I don't know if I'm remembering that miss correctly, but so I wanted to get clarity on that. We have this first document dump in 90, what year was it?
96.
96. And then is that it, or they're still getting these, supposed
So no,
leaks for more
that
time?
thread continued a lot over the years, actually. And, they got a lot of testimony from, different people, insiders, and so on and so forth. And then they also found some
primary source people that were there at the time. Talking to him.
That's
pretty important.
Well, and that's the kind of really critical details that are left out because his books aren't fully translated right now. And that's kind of also why I think it's so important to kind of bring this to a more American audience, because this kind of like intrigue very much necessitates that you kind of understand this guy's life's work and the way that he's gone, taking trips all over Italy, talking to people, all over Italy about this for his entire life since childhood. Like he's extremely involved in this subject. He even tells stories about how when he was a kid, he used to go to the library and find UFO books and then go bother people, that were way older than him. And they had no idea that he was very young, but because he would send them valuable correspondence and they would just respond like he was just like a normal person, and inspired him to get super deep into all this. So I think for Pinotti, like, it's very unfair to not look at the full landscape that he provides on this case, because it's rich and in depth, and it's not just these documents. He's done a crazy amount of work over his life's work to try to corroborate these details. And, he's had significant fruit. Some of the stuff that was recently released is he found some independent archival materials that stated the existence of RS-33. And that's like a fact. They found it completely separate documents in an archive that spoke about the existence of RS-33.
All right, so let me pause you there for a second. First, what would you say? How many books has he written, Pinotti, and what would you say would be the one that's the most important? And how many have you read?
So I've read to the chopped version of like 2 or 3.
Okay.
And just using translation tools the best that I can, and trying to, look for keywords, especially, which has definitely been the most helpful out of all of it, because obviously a lot of it is, he's a general UFOologist on top of all of this. So he has a lot of, tangentially related research that isn't necessarily about 1933 in his books. But I'd say the most important one is the most recent one that he published after after he met with David Grusch, on that podcast.
Sure.
And that he is, that he's, I'm sure, currently looking to be translated into English right now, because it fully outlines the series of events. It includes his, his belief that it was a member of the Ciano family that provided with him the documents anonymously. And he goes through his whole chain of reasoning for that and the reason why and et cetera in that book.
Right.
So
that's great. So then people should check that out for sure. I'm going to try to check it out and maybe translate some parts of it. So then before I forget the question, I want to ask you, those people that he has interviewed that were, say, working at that exact time that these documents were speaking of, is there one that is something very significant that they have testified to?
So I don't know that part, and I struggle with the details on this part because this is obviously the kind of granular information that I really need to get from him directly when we're like having a conversation. So
He
it would,
hasn't published in his books and these interviews with firsthand witnesses.
I don't know that he necessarily has. I mean, well, I think
Okay.
he has actually. Well, of UFO sightings, absolutely. As far as ones that are particularly concerned with the 1933 case, I believe he doesn't have people who directly have information about the craft, but people whose family members had information about the craft. So secondary sources. I
Okay.
wouldn't say that he has like a primary firsthand source, um,
Gotcha.
because obviously by the time that he picked it up in the 90s, it was already 70 years old.
Sure.
So
Right.
it's he was already kind of walking into a really difficult information landscape when this all started 25 years ago. So
Right.
that's definitely kind of like the reasoning for that. And and it's not to say that he has nothing either. Some of the secondary uh, evidence that he's presented absolutely creates a chain of circumstantial evidence in the kind of geographical area that the crash was supposed to happen. So he's absolutely, I'd say, done the basics for trying to figure this out. But obviously, it's just logistically, um, after all this time, I think it was maybe too much to surmount. So for like a necessarily like a firsthand witness. But then the most interesting secondary source that's actually disconnected from Pinotti, I think, that made a claim about this was Marconi's nephew, which people argue about how much they knew each other or how much they're actually connected to each other, of course. But,
Mm-hmm.
Marconi's nephew absolutely made some direct claims saying that his uncle was directly involved with RS-33. He knew about it and that it was about the UFOs, and that, he made some direct claims
And
about.
for the listener, can you review who Marconi is?
So Marconi was, a really important figure in telecommunications. A lot of people may know him kind of as the guy who was competing a lot with Tesla for the radio patent. A lot of people say that, in courts say that Tesla was first, but courts at the time didn't really agree and called Marconi first. So he kind of essentially collaborated closely with Edison and ended up kind of winning the game as far as it was.
Sure.
And to the great jargon of Tesla, which
So
is
Marconi's nephew
yeah.
says that his uncle knew about this.
Well,
Is that
yeah,
correct?
not only that he knew about it, but he was head of the RS-33 cabinet,
So yeah, what
which
did
is one of the main
RS3
claims of Pinotti.
what did RS-333 stand for, and what's the documentation that tells us this existed?
So I'm not sure. I'm not exactly sure how. It's. I think it's possible that. And please forgive me if I don't understand this part of the story right, but I believe that Pinotti knew about RS-33 before he even got the documents. He had already heard that term, and he already knew that name from insiders and stuff.
Interesting. Okay.
And so I think that he didn't get documentary evidence until that more recent stuff that I was talking about, where they found in a separate archive, the existence of RS-33 listed on a piece of paper. That was more recent where they found that.
So we know for sure, based on official Italian government archives, that RS-333 existed as a unit,
Yes,
and
that's
the connection that's been sort of hypothesized or argued is that they were the ones or at least housing this unknown crashed aircraft and potentially trying to reverse engineer it or do something, study it.
yes. And and the idea is that it was a special research group that was essentially formed to respond to something that they most likely thought was prosaic and just thought represented a strategic flaw in their plan. They just, someone's way more advanced than us. We need to figure this out ASAP. Like, and
So on that point, yeah.
and so
On,
and I think that that's also maybe why there's not a lot of documentary evidence about the crash itself being anomalous, because how would they have really known it was? I think.
sure. And on that point, because so my knowledge base is sort of a mixture of the different materials I studied for this. So your guys' interview, I had watched the UAP Gerb documentary and some of his research. I also, before any of that, just read the actual, there was UFO magazine articles about this, through the years in the 90s and so forth. So I think I read those first, and anyway, this is sort of how I have it all pieced together now. But one thing I can remember specifically is from the UAP Gerb documentary was he was saying that allegedly Mussolini believed that it was French or German and that Marconi believed it was non-human. Is that just someone's speculation, or is there some sort of chain of
So
where that idea comes from?
I fear that chain of information may be poisoned by Brophy, which is not a good source. I'm sure you've come across Brophy in all this.
Have not. Nope. Don't Brophy.
William Brophy is a lot of people have described him as a sort of Forrest Gump of ufology. He'd turn up in all kinds of different places and make claims about himself or his family.
And he's from the U.S.?
Yes.
Yo,
And
how
he
have
did
I
meet.
missed this guy?
He did meet with Pinotti, and obviously Pinotti doesn't necessarily believe him, but it's part of Pinotti's formative experience with U.S. people, because obviously it doesn't happen every day for him. He had somebody pop up on him and start giving him details, so he was like, okay, interesting, and he just kind of, obviously, like a true academic, was just like, we'll see what happens, and nothing ever really came of it, obviously, because I don't know if if there's anything to that. I just ignored it because there's just too much intrigue, and it doesn't seem likely, and it's just, I also don't want to get bogged down in the kind of like later allegations of, because like also a lot of people latch onto is that they think that Grusch's claims about Magenta are directly related to Brophy. But the thing about that is that Grusch directly refutes that in his interview with Pinotti, where he states that his information about Magenta becomes from first-hand witnesses that are totally uncorrelated to the UFO community in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
So that completely eliminates Brophy in any sense of the word, because obviously he has non-public sources for the Magenta crash, and that was his reasoning for making his claims about the Magenta crash.
Right. And, multiple things with what you said there. One is, I don't know if everybody who's listening knows the context, but I think it's important to this case, this story, is the fact that David Grusch said that there was in 1933, according to his 4-year investigation and the classified materials that he studied, and part of what he submitted in his whistleblower case to the ICIG was, yes, in fact, and this was one of the surprising things, in that first interview in 2023 with News Nation, where he said 1933, Italy, and the Vatican even, right? So that's very significant, sort of an overlooked detail. One thing that's interesting is that I had spoken with sort of someone from the older generation of ufology, sort of in that first wave of the Grusch disclosures, and he was saying to me, oh, I'm just worried because the 1933 Magenta case, it's a well-known proven hoax. And so the fact that he's going up there saying that, and I was like, I didn't know anything about the case at that point, and I was sort of like, okay, I'm curious why people think it's a hoax. So there's that aspect, plus the fact that I just really, really doubt that someone of Grusch's level, and after all the vetting he had to go through, 16 months of having all of his information scrutinized, that then when he goes and speaks, he would attach to something like that. I think he would be smart enough to something that's still kind of unknown,
especially to a foreign
to be like, right, to be like, oh, we're not sure if it's something, but he said it like it was a fact.
Yeah. Well, and this especially hits home. I don't know if you've seen it, but the interview between Pinotti and Grusch, it just makes all this painfully clear.
Yeah, I did, and I actually watched it and took notes on it because it was kind of shorter, which was nice. I think it was only like 20 minutes or something.
Yeah,
but it's very fascinating. Nice. Yeah, people should go watch that. Yeah,
and because it just makes it very clear that Pinotti wasn't expecting Grusch, relying on Grusch, or expecting this to happen. Period. This was all a very big surprise to him. He was, in his mind, it was over as far as the Magenta case, and he never expected, I don't think, there to be this kind of like resurgence of public interest. And, and I can actually narrow down the fact why people say it's a hoax down to one fact.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's because either Pinotti himself or the organizations that he's affiliated with have retained ownership of the documents. And I think it's just that.
That's people's argument for why it's a hoax.
They haven't allowed sufficient third-party review of the documents.
Why would he not,
therefore, so I don't know. And so that's the interesting question. And that's also, whatever the answer is to that question, it's obviously a little bit more complicated than meets the eye.
Yeah.
And, you know, and so to me, I immediately kind of I think that it's they figured out who the anonymous source was, and then they were alive. So you're kind of bound by, if I release the name of this anonymous source, they're going to get, you know, it's going to be a full flood rush on this person.
Okay. Yeah.
Like, so I think that might be kind of what's happening here. He has mentioned protecting sources in the past.
Gotcha.
So, like, I think that that's certainly an element of intrigue at play, but I think that fundamentally, when you boil down all the skepticism around this case, it really does all relate to that one fact. And also the fact that a couple documents were destroyed during the forensic analysis process. So, and I think that, you know, necessitates an extra difficulty to the situation, because then you're extra reliant on the results that were published in the first place, which, you know, as far as I understand, I'm not an academic or an expert in these fields, but it seemed to provide hard data. If you went and had the translations of all of his books and were able to collate all that data, you would be able to see all the specific metrics and instances of all the different chemicals and words and linguistic and other analyses that come together to show the conclusion that they're authentic documents.
Right.
So I have also heard Pinotti make the argument that it's very unscientific and petty of people to demand, you know, third-party review of the documents when essentially he did that.
Right.
You know, he took it to someone who was unrelated to the UFO documents and had them historically validated. So to him, he did the thing he was supposed to do, and he wants to retain his ownership, I think.
Yeah, so that is clear for people, and correct me or add on if I'm wrong, but he had the documents actually tested by someone was supposedly a very well-known, acclaimed forensic scientist in Italy, right?
Yes.
And then he had a well-known historian look at the documents and say they matched with all the formats and stamps and everything else. And these people are apparently sort of not friends with him or anything like that. They were really independent.
Yes. And then so that's and he has, and the names of all these people are available. They're in his books. All this information is in his books.
Sure.
You know, so like it's not like, you know, this is the source of all this is some random YouTube video where he's saying this. This is his corpus of his life's work.
Right. So just to summarize for a bit, we know for sure, we're pretty much almost virtually certain of the authenticity of these documents. And they speak of something unknown crashing and having very tight security around it. Also paired with 3 years after that in 36, reports from Air Force or pilots seeing these UFOs and even a little sketch of them. These documents we know are authentic. You believe that based on your research, and I'd like to at some point get the more details, but that these came from a private archive of Ciano, who was second in command to Mussolini, and then through his daughter. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so that is maybe the provenance of it.
But to not get it confused, so Ciano, Galeazzo Ciano was married to Mussolini's daughter, and so he was Mussolini's son-in-law.
Gotcha.
Also second in command because of that.
Right. Okay, so that's pretty significant. We can pretty much be pretty certain something unusual crashed there in 33, and it was handled with a lot of security. Pair that with the fact that we've touched on briefly here, David Grusch, and everything that's behind him, and all of his 4-year investigation, 16-month vetting by the Congressional Intelligence Committees and the Inspector General's office. For him to say that, like, I know it, I saw the documents proving it, we can also put a lot of stock in that as well, to this basic fact. Now, so here's where I want to go is we can establish that. Let's shift away a little bit from those primary documents and what we can know before the layer now of interpretation, secondary information, building over the years, building over in Pinotti, as you've spoken about.
Yeah.
And now let's get into the realm of what is the speculation, what are the hypotheses, what are the theories, what other data points paint more of a picture of this craft really was anomalous. What kind of propulsion did it have? What did they do with it? And then leading to the last thing, which I know Elizondo has said is true, and also Eric Davis has said is true at the congressional briefing recently, according to him, that the craft was actually transferred at the end of World War II. So in all of that, where do we get these ideas of what it looked like, what happened to it? What is there any information supposedly on the propulsion and any conclusions that were supposedly made about it, or is it all just one big mystery? I assume there has to be more that Pinotti has put together, obviously. So I'm curious what you could share with us about that.
So, okay, we'll start at a first principles levels of who was kind of in RS-33 and who kind of like made up the strategic kind of like objectives of that effort as it was starting, because it's very illuminating for how it progressed. And then we'll kind of interject some context about Italian politics that's relevant as we get later in the 30s, and kind of like exemplify how there was a very sudden lurch towards the Germans that had a very, very, very resounding impact on the situation, particularly on the RS-33 situation and its management and its ownership. So as it formed in 1933, there's a whole list of scientists that Pinotti has collated. And, most of these scientists on the surface don't have a lot of smoking gun connections to this sort of activity, other than that they were pretty much all ardent fascists. So on a baseline, it was plausible that group of people that Pinotti alleges to make up RS-33, it is plausible that they were those people on just the principle that they were fascists enough to get in that kind of position. And they were well connected enough in high enough institutions to also kind of be considered for something so important, I guess. So that's kind of like at the baseline. I don't know a lot of specifics about them yet. I'm still kind of individually digging into each one. I know a lot more about the more famous allegations, which are Marconi, Fermi, interesting enough, and the Panspermia boys. And then also Ciano himself, Galeazzo Ciano. And so it's kind of my hypothesis that Galeazzo Ciano was pretty much, who Mussolini probably first turned to help him manage this situation, because he was essentially a trusted family member that he was already using for other of the most sensitive of Italy's foreign policy matters. He was the future foreign policy minister. In fact, he would become the foreign policy minister in 1936. So I just think that, and actually in 1933, he became the press minister. So in August, shortly after the craft. So if there's, one person who could have ensured that the crash never really made it to newspapers, it was Ciano, because he was directly connected to all the publishers and all the, newspapers in the country to essentially kind of, create like a German style of media control in Italy. And that's kind of what, Mussolini was envisioning at the time. But so for Fermi, though, I think that he's probably the most interesting figure that probably got related, because he was deeply connected to fascist networks, but he wasn't so much of a fascist himself. I mean, that's obviously evidenced by the way that after the racial laws happened in 1938 in Italy, where they began prosecuting Jewish people and removing them from positions of office and academic positions and such, Fermi left because, his wife was Jewish, and he was like, I'm not putting up with this.
Right.
He went and got his Nobel Prize and then scooted off over to the Manhattan Project to go, change teams.
Right.
So the kind of implication there is that if he was involved in 1933, he was no longer involved by 1939 or 1940.
Sure.
And there's also a high potential that when he immigrated to the United States, he took any information that he had about the 1933 craft, its location, it's the research, the preliminary research and findings that they had been done on it, all went directly to, the most powerful physicists in America that he was then kind of instantly collaborating with over there.
Right. Well, I would venture to hypothesize that he would have kept that as a kind of card for his path in the U.S., who exactly he's going to divulge that information to.
And it's also very possible that once he saw that the U.S. had custody of the craft, he was like, okay, now I'll, reveal my kind of strategic position here. Now that I see that, who's now that the dust is settled and I see who has it actually.
Do you know what year he comes the Fermi paradox becomes popular?
I'm not certain, but I think about that all the time, man. I just, and I have a really unique perspective on that because I often wonder how much he would have agreed with UAP secrecy that maybe people like Alan Dulles and James Angleton would have been pitching around the national security state at the time. I almost wonder if he would have been against that. And I almost wonder if the Fermi paradox is a way of challenging that kind of like infrastructure to say like, oh yeah, you want to cover it up? Well, then let me just make it really obvious to people in a basic thought experiment that if they're here, you should be able to see them. So, if there's one UFO sighting that's true, they're here. And, that's kind of, you're playing the fool for sitting around and arguing about it.
Sure. I like that interpretation. I like it. It's more of a positive spin on, whereas my mind is more cynically kind of weathered at this point. And I suspect, did Fermi plant that meme to I don't know, just keep the conversation about extra outer space, extraterrestrials, when maybe something else was going on in secret bases and stuff that was human made. But I'm open to, I like that idea that was a hint from him to people. Like you said, they should be here. The probability is extremely low that they're not. So,
right. And one, and it's also, and also, I think that just when you think in real reality and not stochastic physics reality, you get to a very different kind of place than if you're just thinking about estimations. Because when you think about the true range of actual possibilities in our complicated system, it's much more expansive than, a lot of people like to say that we can calculate. And so, but that's not an excuse to ignore what we can't calculate. And that's, something that really frustrates me about the direction of a lot of mainstream science is that they're very content to just ignore all the other disciplines of science that are ultimately relevant to their discipline. You can't avoid the interconnective nature of all these different disciplines. And doing so is just is a farce and also a scam, in my opinion. So
I hear you.
See it.
I hear you. So this RS-33.
Yeah.
So more about that. From what you've researched, how did this list of scientists, was it known? It was just sort of compiled together by Pinotti. Was there a document that listed these individuals, especially let's just say some of the higher case ones like Marconi and Fermi? Does that just come from the nephew? And then aside from all that, continue telling us what we think might have happened with this RS-33 group, what they did with this craft, this object, this unknown vehicle, and how that played out, as you alluded to before, as we got through the World War II, and then the collaboration with him, as you sort of hinted at, the big change in the program when Germany comes into the picture.
Right. So, RS-33, and to just kind of address your first question, I think that it's been really difficult for me to kind of obtain the granular details about how he found out the members of RS-33. That's one of the big questions that I have right now. Okay. And, and I'll be the first to admit here that, I'm certainly not Roberto Pinotti. I don't speak Italian. And
I wish I did.
Me too. God, me too. And I've been learning slowly but surely. And, it's not quite as difficult as I really once thought. But at the same time, though, it's just it is a significant crippling factor when it comes to having those sort of details. I would love to know exactly how he came across that information, and I'm working on it. We're working on getting in contact with him so that I can, get and make and have direct access to that kind of granular information when I'm just like asking him stuff.
Sure.
But I don't have it quite yet. So, but from what I understand, though, it's from a mixture of secondhand witness testimony, documentary evidence. He's engaged with people inside the Italian government and Congress on several occasions for sort of investigations and other stuff going on that has influenced a series of events and perhaps provided him with more names. But that's a complicated web that I'm not super clear on. So I couldn't give a definitive answer on where every name comes from, unfortunately. But
that makes sense. So then let's get into then what does RS-33 believe to have really done with this?
So now I have a much better idea of kind of like their timeline and where they went, where they were doing stuff. We have a much better idea of that.
Mhm.
So it's alleged that the craft was immediately taken to a SIAC, not SAIAC, but the Marchetti airfields, which are very close to Milan, and that they were essentially kind of held temporarily there, while they kind of formed the group, figure out what they were going to do in Rome, and then also came to the preliminary understanding that this wasn't something normal, and it wasn't just going to be solved with the normal engineering problems. It was going to require a more specialized approach. So I categorize probably 1933 until 1937 is around the time where it was at those airfields, as far as we know, from the time that it crashed to about 1937.
And ostensibly, they're not doing a whole lot with it yet. They're
Well,
still
and
trying to
right,
just
because
do
if
some
you're a monkey
basic
with an iPhone,
studies.
if you're a monkey with an iPhone, it's going to take you a while to even figure out how to click a button to turn it on.
Sure.
So, and I think it's very possible that they faced that exact scenario where, they were kind of expecting to be able to, turn some wrenches, pull it apart, and figure out what's going on like that. And then all of a sudden, the project is 2 years along, and you've got all the scientists arguing with each other, and Mussolini just kind of sits back and it's like, what's going on? And then that's maybe at that point, he was like, okay, we need to take this even more seriously, and we need to do something even more serious, which is, I think, the next phase comes in the Sorrate bunker, which is the Sorrate bunker is genuinely the most fascinating angle to this case.
How do you spell the name?
Soratte, the Sorrate bunker on Mount Sorrate. And it was essentially a complex that Mussolini had built, starting in 1937, that was meant to be a giant secret facility, the largest one in Europe at the time. And it's essentially the updated allegation from Pinotti in his most recent book that from 1937 to the end of the war, where the craft was recovered by the Americans, that's where not only RS-33 was housed, but that's also where the craft was housed, and that's also where it was taken possession of by two different parties. And so that would be first the Germans and then the Americans. So,
and what year supposedly the Germans?
So the Germans took over the bunker, and this is a fact, in 1943. Kesselring actually took over the bunker and used it as his headquarters during the Italian campaign when he was fighting along the Gustav line and repelling the Allied invasion that would, cause the liberation of Rome. Like the Anzio beachhead. And
have you done any digging on the actual sort of official documentation on what was officially done at Sorrate bunker this time?
Yeah. And, and there's a lot of intrigue there because obviously it was very secretive before the Germans took it over. It had barely opened and been completed, but it's kind of my theory that they kind of like moved the craft in as it was being constructed, because that was probably the most secure time for one. And then for two, is also just probably the most convenient because it was probably, I think it was huge, 30 feet, nothing to scoff at.
All right, I wanted to clarify that before. What do the reports are saying? The 30 feet diameter.
Yeah, that's from Pinotti and Grusch. They spoke a lot about that in their video about the size, shape, and those kind of different metrics.
And let's clarify that as well, because I don't have it written down or anything, but I believe Grusch said kind of flying saucer shape, but more like somewhat of an acorn.
Lenticular was the word that he used. And I think he also kind of maybe said a little bit of an acorn shape. And then he also specifically stated no bodies that he was aware of.
Right? I remember him phrasing it like that. And I want to get into that lore as well, because, but we'll sort of segue into that. Let's stick on our RS-33 a little bit here and what you were saying with the craft being moved to Germany in 1943.
Oh, no. So actually staying
German possession, operation, but staying at the same facility. Yes.
Right. So, And this is an especially complicated series of events because at the time, Italy would have been moving the craft. It was around the same time that they instituted the racial laws, and it would have changed the composition of RS-33 significantly. And also Marconi dies around this time, interestingly enough. And there's also a couple other just high-profile deaths and mysterious deaths around the Mussolini regime, around the 37-38 period. Majorana also disappears. Ettore Majorana, which is really close, or was favored by Fermi, and who Fermi said that Majorana was really, 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 really smart, like smarter than him. And he was like, doing very complicated quantum work for the time, so I could see why you could say that. But yeah, as far as the world knows right now, Majorana, disappeared around this time, and there's all sorts of intrigue going on.
What's the name?
In Italy?
How do you spell it? What is it?
Majorana, Majorana. Majorana.
Wait, like major, like military rank, or this is one word?
No, it's one word, so it's like Italian. It's like Ettore, Ettore. I'm probably butchering this so bad. I feel so bad.
Oh, so this is his last name.
Yeah, the Majorana is his last name.
Major.
Yeah, ANA.
ANA.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there was recently, I don't know, you might have heard the news of the Majorana chip that Microsoft released that was based on his quantum principles from like the fucking 1930s, which we had come across him in our research, and when we saw that drop, we were like, what the hell? It's so weird. And so that kind of started the speculation for us that maybe Majorana actually escaped to the United States and alongside Fermi, which and then kind of became one of those dark scientists that we kind of talked about a little bit before the call here.
Right.
And so I kind of lost track a little bit. We're kind of
so we were just sort of digging into like what happened at Sorrate bunker that we know about officially, and what's the speculation on what happened with this craft.
So around that time that it would have gotten to the Sorrate bunker, it's possible that the original group that was studying RS-33 didn't even really, not all of them even really made it to like the craft being at the bunker.
Sure.
It's
these teams were like liquidated, often in these fascist regimes, Germany, Italy, just
exactly. And people would take on crazy amounts of positions and complicate things and so on and so forth. So surely that happened here too. And so best I understand, after the racial laws and kind of like a lot of intrigue around the program, they kind of, I think, started over with the Germans in 38, 39, where they kind of went up to the Germans and been like, hey, we kind of screwed the pooch here, but this is like really important, so we need to figure this out. So come to the bunker and help us study this thing so we can figure this out, is what I think happened. And that's around the time that the war was kind of starting, and Italy and the United States were drifting apart and becoming less and less friendly. So I think that's kind of why at first the Italians in 1933 itself kind of went up to the Americans like, hey, help us out, like let's figure this out, is kind of my best theory right now. And then kind of as that kind of fell apart and Italy wasn't really getting what they wanted, and also other stuff kind of got in the middle of it, they just turned to Germany for the same exact thing. And then from there it went completely underground, and they were using, likely the dirtiest mechanisms that they had access to prevent any sort of information about their research from kind of making the light of day here. If they had a habit of doing all kinds of unaccountable activities in concentration camps. And one can imagine a series of awful and horribly unethical experiments that could be conducted with a UFO in a similar context. How people could just very much evaporate under the guise of scientific discovery. So I think that's why Kesselring knew that the bunker was of the utmost strategic importance to take over when Italy surrendered and joined the Allies, which the OSS was also all mixed up in. It was actually a very similar effort to the Sunrise negotiations that was happening amongst the U.S. government and the Italian government to kind of get the royal side of the Italian government to come back to power so that they could legitimize the claim of allies with the ally.
Right.
And obviously the political situation in fucking Italy is so complicated around that time. It's a nightmare.
Sure.
Because you got all these different groups vying with each other for power and stuff. But
Right.
Essentially what kind of happened is that the Germans kind of outmaneuvered the Italians and were able to disarm and capture a lot of the Italian military's resources. And the Sorrate bunker kind of being the crown jewel of that. He literally took it over, used it as his headquarters, set up his entire radio corps there, and it was fundamentally one of the most important pieces of real estate in the entire war from that point forward in 1943.
Gotcha.
And this is also kind of like in the midst of Wolf, Karl Wolf, which
Dulles'
was
buddy.
primarily, which is primarily responsible for the Sunrise negotiations. This whole time, Karl Wolf is circling Kesselring and starting to convince him to go along with the Sunrise negotiations.
Sure.
So
that connection, those dots sort of point towards this idea that the object was transferred into Allied, U.S. particularly, custody by war's end.
Well, yeah, because Kesselring, Wolf, and Dolman, which were the three main figures at the bunker and operating out of the bunker, all had extensive and crazy dealings with Dulles. All of them.
Okay.
And
so that's a pretty strong link.
It is. It's a very strong link. It's a very, very strong link because
if we can get more clarity if that this object, this craft was really at this Sorrate bunker.
Well, and that's a really interesting scenario too, because it's quite possible that the knowledge of it in itself could have been relegated to like just Kesselring or just Wolf or just the two of them. Because, the ability for security in a bunker like that, was obviously much higher than other places. So they, false walls, it could have been that all of the RS-33 work and documents and the craft itself were in, a section of tunnel that looked abandoned and nobody even really knew it was there, but Kesselring knew it was there. Like, that's certainly absolutely a possibility. Because, Germans obviously already had a really advanced sense of compartmentalized and protected and secret information. They had been abusing those concepts since very early before the war. So that would have been nothing new to essentially keep knowledge of the craft compartmentalized. And actually really interesting, there is a big rumor of a bunch of crates being transported from the bunker under mysterious circumstances. 79 crates that were supposedly gold, but then could also potentially have been the deconstructed Magenta craft. And then the story goes, and it is kind of like a folklore kind of thing. So, just to be clear about what this is.
Sure.
But the folklore goes is that, Kesselring ordered the movement of these massive trucks with a bunch of crates on them, and then had everybody who moved the trucks executed. And so nobody knows what happens to the trucks afterwards. And they say, oh, it was gold, blah, 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 blah. But people have obviously debunked that it was the gold because they moved at a different time and they proved it some other way that they moved it on this other time or whatever. So basically it wasn't the gold, but they moved. There is some story in the local vernacular of there being a huge convoy and it being a big to-do thing, and then a bunch of people got killed over it. And really interestingly, one of those Germans actually survived a shot in the fucking head.
Wow.
Which is insane. And then came back searching the area for the gold for years afterwards until he was brutally executed when he returned home by way of decapitation.
Yeah.
So this is like a little random tangent about the kind of the deep mystery surrounding just the bunker itself. Like it's very much a kind of mysterious and not a fully acknowledged for its true history kind of place. Like
and there's many of those that were never told about.
And an especially interesting fact that I've most recently learned about Kesselring is that in the Nuremberg trials, he factually lied about his appearance and position inside the bunker on a particular date in March in 1944 at the Nuremberg trials. There was a operation called the Jenny 2 operation, which if you definitely want to write that one out and check it out. It's really weird. Jenny 1 was essentially where they had a bunch of uniformed officers. American officers.
G or J? Jenny?
Jenny with G.
Genny?
Oh, Ginny. 2.
These were the code names of the operation?
Yes. Jenny 1 and 2. Where essentially they had American officers in full dress uniform go behind enemy lines to connect with subversives. And of course, this group of ones got caught. And Kesselring lied that he wasn't there when he ordered their execution, but he actually was there. And documentary evidence proves that, he perjured himself in the Nuremberg trials, specifically concerning the Sorrate bunker. So Kesselring was lying about the Sorrate bunker for a fact.
Sure.
And that's like indisputable. So if he lied about that one thing, obviously, there's the very established documentary trail that he could be lying about other things.
Right. What ultimately happens with him in the post-war?
He spent some time in jail after clinking champagne and hanging out with the Sunrise guys kind of immediately after the war for a little while. And they kind of, shuffle him around different POW camps. And
eventually so he just did
a light and reduced sentence.
Yeah.
And then he goes and meets up with Gelhin and the rest of them, just like all of them do.
Oh, so he joins the Gallon gang.
Yeah, absolutely.
At the beginning.
Well, I mean, it was the only thing to do. You know? I mean, where else would you go as a former Nazi? You have no credibility. Nobody likes you except for former Nazis. So
you go down. You could go anywhere. You go down to Argentina. That
well, and a lot of people argue it's the same network. So
yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, it was a little bit factional.
Right, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. No way you could say it wasn't. Yeah. But I think there was a cohesion there that people on the outside of it underestimated.
Sure, absolutely. So RS-33, the Sorrate bunker, and so all this is going on. I mean, do we have any speculation or claims about what was achieved by the time the craft was handed over, allegedly handed over, and then what it supposedly is taken to Wright Field in the U.S. and then studied? And this, I've heard this was in late 44.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
So, yeah. And so essentially a lot of what my work has been doing has been establishing possibility. Mm-hmm. Is it possible that this even remotely happened? Was there connections between all these different elements that made it possible for an object of this size logistically to make it from one enemy side to the other? Because just in itself, thinking about that is an extremely large logistical challenge. On an active battlefield, to transfer something amongst two hostile parties that, is of incredible strategic value.
Why wouldn't they just have transferred it, though? Like, where does this claim of 44 that, for example, I heard Eric Davis say, I don't know if he's misspeaking, but what would make more sense would be, May and beyond 45. Because we know with Operation Lusty and the Air Force, they went there, they shipped whole aircrafts back, so we know that happened just after the surrender.
Right. Well, and but that's an interesting thing, because if you're thinking about what's going to give you the best security on both sides, you need to hide it from not only the German side and everything that's going on the German side, but you also need to hide it from like 99% of the Allied side. So you almost kind of need the protocols of active war in order to have the kind of security that even made anything like this even possible. And it essentially took a collaboration between Karl Wolff and Alan Dulles to create a strategic picture where they could collaborate deeply to make this happen, as I think almost as evidence that the Sunrise negotiations were happening in good faith and would bear fruit. I think that essentially they kind of lured it over Dulles' head as the Sunrise negotiations were engaging in 1943 between all the intermediaries, and essentially said, we're willing to give you this craft as a sign of good faith if you then work with us to distribute the benefits of all the research that we also have acquired from the Italians. They essentially leverage both parts. They did the craft itself as a kind of proof of concept that we can be trusted and that these negotiations will go somewhere. And then when they actually handed off the documents, that was like essentially the same thing as handing over the scientists. And and around that time, there's also this project called the McGregor Project that was initiated by the JCS and kind of other factions of the U.S. military to kind of create that surrender on the Italian side that I had been speaking about earlier. And as soon as the British kind of moved in there and kind of made that happen, it wasn't actually the Americans who made that happen. It was the British who went up to the Italian king and was like, yo, you got to like do this and like surrender, and we got to like make this work like now. Right. They immediately transitioned into just acquiring as much important Italian technology, especially particularly their naval technology, as possible. And there's a ton of interesting names and figures that I could spend 10 hours talking about that relate to the McGregor Project. And we have a ton of information about all that and a ton of original documents about the McGregor Project that a lot of people don't have, simply because it's just not a well-known project. Nobody even really knows about it. But but that all that work is still ongoing. We're still processing a lot of that documentary evidence and considering how it all necessarily connects to Magenta. But there's absolutely some overlap between the scientific and technical information that was transferred in the McGregor Project around that time in 1944 and the Magenta craft itself. And the McGregor Project also shows that the infrastructure in order to move an object like the Magenta craft through Italy, through the ports, to the United States, absolutely existed, hands down, without a doubt. Sure. Even from 1943 forward, DO&I was deeply concerned and invested in those kinds of capabilities. And so they were collaborating deeply with the OSS to provide those kind of capabilities to the OSS further end customer of FDR. And that's an interesting series of intrigue in itself, is that FDR dies kind of like in the middle of this situation ripening, kind of like as this plan is playing out that Kesselring is gonna capitulate at the last moment after extending the war, and we're gonna make it all look all hunky dory. Alan Dulles and Donovan have to go explain to a new executive the way that they've just been breaking the law for 18 months.
Sure.
And
so that then they can create another organization that breaks the law for about 40 or 30 years until the hearings in the 70s with the CIA. Right. And then figured out how to continue doing it from the 70s till today without running into an exposure like that, like the church hearings. But yeah.
Right. Yeah. Nice guys, right?
Yeah, no, the best, just the best. Yeah. Yeah.
But and a really important detail I want to mention here is that Donovan was very, very, very active in the Italian scene right around the time that it's alleged that this all was going down. And essentially my kind of best hypothesis for when the craft itself was actually moved is like March to May 1944, so not even late 1944.
So early,
like early. And I personally think that Donovan probably got all drunk, slapped together a ragtag crew of some people that he knew and kind of trusted, went and picked up the craft from a location that the Germans had dropped it, and then took it onto a ship with one of his other buddies, maybe even Forrestal, and then hauled it all the way back to the U.S. And it essentially personally secured its provenance over to the United States. Because I struggle to believe that anything but the highest level of American intelligence would be equipped to deal with that scenario with the proper authority. And then also a really compelling detail that makes that plausible in my eyes is that right after he participates deeply in the Battle of Anzio and the liberation of Rome and D-Day, he did all three by some crazy miracle of God, or at least that's what his historical account says. Then right then in July in 1945, he goes and meets with the Pope and has this long meeting with the Pope about his kind of strategic, position in all this as a Knight of Malta, because he was a member of the Knights of Malta alongside James Angleton. So that was like a critical part of his network. And that's also kind of when I factually unraveled that not only does Donovan has the motive the means, the network, and the ability to acquire information and intelligence about a craft from the Pope. He was in a one-on-one secure conversation with the Pope at the time, just after it supposedly happened. So it's a much stronger chain of circumstantial evidence when you look at it that way. Like the idea that the craft was taken in 1944 by the Americans. And that's all just to say that it is factually possible that all these people were in a position that this thing could have happened. I've done all this work just to establish that. And so my hypothesis obviously extends that, they directly managed this situation in different ways, but that's getting into the much more speculation. I need more documentary evidence. I still have a lot to learn about that side of it. Hypothesis wise, the fact that it's possible is about as far as I'm willing to go right at the moment, because that's what the evidence supports.
Sure. And I think it is important, again, to go back to the fact that David Grusch has, verbally under oath attested to his conclusion that this event did take place and whatever this craft was transferred. So there is sort of that in the backdrop. Not that means it's definitely true, but the fact, again, that he could conclude that after a position he was in, that none of us UFO researchers have ever been in that I'm aware of, where you're given congressional mandate to go be read into various secret access programs and compile and report and do it for 4 years as your job. It's like crazy. and then it wasn't, he had to have that all vetted by multiple different parties. But so the fact that he says it happened is interesting. I still can't just believe it because he said it, but what you said just there is important, because you are establishing that all the parts that would need to be there are in place, and it's painting this dot connected picture of it's likely that this is how it happened, especially given the fact that this has been attested to. The document showing something really unusual and unknown did crash, was treated with a lot of security. There was apparently sightings of UFOs at around that same time. So there's still a lot of open questions, though. And I guess, from a zoomed out perspective, I just want to ask, what's the talk about? Is there any talk about particularly this craft? Any more features about it? And what, was it that significant? What did it do for the U.S.? Was it really the crown jewel? Or do you think it's possible this was a limited hangout type of thing of here's this carrot, we're going to make this deal, but this ain't really the top of the top. But maybe it is.
Well, and I think that, I think that actually what the 1933 case actually represents is the first major time that Alan Dulles and the group of people are actually able to manage the story in a way that, opened up, one, possibilities for counterintelligence, of course, and then for two, also placed them in a strategic position to prevent an open reverse engineering war across the globe just after World War II. And so that's kind of the strategic impetus that I see that came out of the 1933 craft. Not so much, though, that it was their only craft at the time, or, this was their only indication that this was going on. I don't really think so. I think they knew about it earlier. I think they had already been discussing issues like this, and particularly in forums like on the Council on Foreign Relations. I think that was a major hub for the kind of earliest official activity as far as the U.S. goes.
Right.
And I think that, it was an issue that they intellectually recognized the problems with trying to manage it. And they naturally, were asking the best and brightest minds that they had access to help them crack the situation, figure out what to do.
Sure.
And so I think for Alan Dulles particularly, I think this actually goes back to the reason why he even wrote a book about Operation Sunrise. I think it might actually be because of the intelligence win that was represented by his activities with the Ciano diaries, and the way that refocused everything on the Germans and the evil of the Nazis rather than, you know, the kind of potential connections between the highest levels of the Allies and the Nazis and the Italians, which could have been a really big story at the time, because obviously a lot of people were already kind of like, you know, I remember Standard Oil was selling oil to Italy and Germany when the Spanish Civil War started. And, you know, they're obviously Standard Oil, super unfavorable opinion in the U.S. at the time because of FDR, who had campaigned against them.
Right.
So, like,
and they were also selling oil to Germany while we were at war with them during World War II.
Absolutely. Cash and carry neutrality, baby. Cash and carry neutrality.
Well, but even when beyond that, though, even when we were actively at war.
Oh, yeah. Because it was, because they just separated it by one more degree. And just essentially said they passed laws or lobbied for laws that essentially said that if, you know, they take it on their own vessel and they pay in cash.
Right. So, you know, we've done a good job sort of outlining and prying into some of this. It's obviously very complicated. We could probably talk for 5 hours straight here. Yeah. We've covered a good amount of bases. Where I'm sort of at right now is looking at all this and then just saying, okay, well, I wonder what this really was, you know, and the assumption, of course, is or this is something extraterrestrial or non-human or something. But, you know, I don't just default to that. It's kind of like, what was this and what did this represent? What kind of physics or propulsion or uniqueness to the craft, and what happened afterwards? And so, you know, I have seen in the literature this lore of some second or third or fourth hand witness at some point saying there was a story, a legend of bodies. Have you touched on that? And what did they say the bodies were like? And, you know, where did this come from? From my memory, they were actually describing them as like human looking or Nordic looking.
And so, you know, and this is obviously a interesting but very controversial thread. And it ties deeply into the kind of the racial issues surrounding Italy and Germany. And I think that's why perhaps also it's so uncertain whether or not any of this is even true. Because I know that Brophy is one source. I know that he's not the only source of the claims of bodies surrounding this case. But
there was like a neighborhood, you know, grandparent and then the grandchild supposedly, I think, told Pinotti, right? Like, oh, there was always a story that there was.
And that's one of the details that I'm not quite super clear on, because it's definitely somewhere in his books and cataloged in one of the many instances that he has of very similar situations, probably.
Okay.
So, I don't want to speak too specifically on it because I'm not totally sure, but that sounds like something I've heard before as well. And also just would kind of make sense because, you know, that's really, from an information landscape perspective, that's all that's actually like available, is that kind of like second and third really hand kind of testimony. I mean, like, it's not really like likely that there's any documents that line out any of these kinds of situations, or like, you know, if there are, they're most likely probably in unlikely places that we wouldn't even necessarily know to like look. And so it makes it an extremely difficult logistical problem on the bodies front. I will say there's a couple interesting things. So the group that Pinotti alleges that made up RS-33 included several famous medical professionals. So for me, there's only two reasons to include medical professionals in this search of something. And that's if you have people getting actively injured by its presence, for one, or if you find something biological inside. That's, you know,
or
pretty much
I would agree with those, but I would also add, if you were going to start to maybe see if you could reverse engineer this for flying with a pilot, you might have aeromedical for the physics of that or whatever, but just to throw that on the table as well.
Yeah, and agreed. But interestingly, though, there was no kind of like there wasn't a lot of aeronautical experience within the group. It's actually a lot more like biologists. There was a famous geneticist in there. And
to be fair, though, this is according to Pinotti's.
This is according to
vague list that we don't even know where that comes from at this point in our conversation, right?
And then coupled with the dubious provenance of the myths of bodies in the first place, it makes for a very shaky ground about the bodies conversation. But I think the general idea, the possibility, is that if they were like Nordic type looking individuals, that might have directly influenced the major shift to the German side, as the Germans conducted an influence operation on the Italians potentially to convince them that it was their technology. That might have been a thing too, where the Germans were just lying to the Italians and saying, oh, yeah, that's like our master species that we're in contact with, and they have this advanced technology, and they're coming over to take over Earth or whatever. And like, if you give it back to us, we'll share the technology with you. And some people kind of postulated that that's maybe why Italy made the sudden and, very historically dubious shift to start prosecuting Jewish people and other, kind of like races. And it was actually, those laws were based on a study done by Italian scientists that basically posited that Italians were Aryans. And that they were that true Italians were of the Aryan kind of blonde hair, blue eyed lineage, and that aligned with the Germans. And that's kind of directly the reason why Mussolini passed the racial laws, was in order to maintain the racial purity of the Italian race. So, one must ask yourself is, how did that idea gain enough steam, as opposed to the exact opposite of what Italy usually is, which is in a really intensely free academic environment because of like Rome and all these other independent universities that had been flourishing in Italy for, almost 1,000 years at this point. So, it's definitely, it's an interesting hypothesis. I wish it had better data associated with it, because it would provide a lot of connective tissue for explaining why the Germans ended up why the Italians ended up siding with the Germans rather than the Americans. Like, it really kind of looked for a while like they would. And, even as the war was starting, Ciano himself worked really hard to keep Italy out of the war. And then Germans even have a source that alleged that he was outed as an Allied spy as early as 1941, from one of Alan Dulles' telegrams, where he essentially said that Ciano was part of an element of Italy that didn't want to go to war and was thinking about deposing Mussolini, even all the way back in 1941. So, I'll just say a quick note too, to kind of just connect some dots here about how, the Pinotti situation may connect to the Ciano and the Dulles situation, is that after Ciano was executed, for voting to oust Mussolini and essentially betraying Mussolini, Etta Ciano met with Alan Dulles in order to give Alan Dulles the Ciano diaries, and also attempt to give him the papers that were associated with the Ciano diaries, which was a series of telegrams that have argued about provenance. But the way the story goes is that she lost those. There's this whole drama about her just getting the diaries themselves to Alan Dulles, and that was just complicated enough so she couldn't give him the documents, the extra documents, as she claimed. But then later on, a German spy who's involved in the situation named Hilda Perwin, or Hilda Beetz, becomes involved, and was involved on the German side. She was a double agent for the Allies and the Germans, but was German in origin. And part of her job, and kind of before Ciano was executed, was to extract information about the diaries and his papers out of him. But when he was executed and kind of like betrayed, that's a really complicated situation. I don't want to get too much into it. But she kept a copy of what she alleged was the papers that went along with the diaries. And when she was being interrogated by James Angleton and the rest, she mentions these documents that she buried in her rose garden and says, hey, these are the documents that were supposed to go along with the Ciano diaries. But then the academic review I was reading of those materials, that's obviously much later on, it was oddly published in 1996, around the same time that Pinotti got his documents.
Yeah.
That that series of documents that Hilda Perwin gave Alan Dulles was actually proven to be a different set of documents. And so it's actually highly unlikely that Alan Dulles ever got the associated materials with the Ciano diaries. So the implication would be is that Etta actually managed to keep a hold of them until her death in 1995. And then one of her immediate next of kin in 1996 attempted to give it to the media, and then Roberto Pinotti.
Right.
And so that would be kind of like the direct provenance of that series of telegrams. And the idea would be is that essentially Ciano collated those series of telegrams from his time as foreign minister as essentially geopolitical leverage to show that, like, hey, I have inside information about the inner workings of the Italian government that is extremely valuable to all parties because it concerns something that we're all concerned with, UFOs. And I'm going to attempt to use this to save my life. And the Germans, you know, kind of knowing what information he had and knowing what he was trying to do, essentially captured him and outmaneuvered him and probably manipulated his wife, Etta, to go along with the situation in order to protect their own control over the assets that he would have essentially been talking about in those documents and been releasing maybe to the public or to the Allies in general or just whatever. Sure. And so, you know, in a critical point of connection there is actually Eugen Dolman, because one of the most key figures in the Sunrise negotiations and the Ciano diaries is Eugen Dolman. He was the point of contact to Etta Ciano to help them escape from Italy after Galeazzo helped depose Mussolini. And he was also one of the first points of contact for Gavernitz and his network that like flushed out the Sunrise negotiations. And he was also deeply involved in the wrap-up of both of those situations, and essentially probably leveraged the knowledge that he had about the Ciano diaries directly to Alan Dulles, because he would have been aware of the materials when they were captured.
Yeah.
And, you know, and also he would have been just aware of the full scope of the materials, what they contained. He essentially would have been at the bunker dealing with the situation before he ever even dealt with the Americans.
Sure. So, I mean, that's a very plausible link to the provenance of the documents. I think that, you know, and it's good to kind of establish that, obviously, that it all being very plausible that something really did happen. And still the bigger question being the more details, you know, what exactly was this? Where did it come from? What did it operate on? What did they conclude? What happened when it got to the U.S.? You know, and there's still things that are not fully understood. It's all very interesting, you know. Back to the bodies for a minute. So the only lore that has sort of come out about bodies, it's never been anything about small gray aliens with big head, big eyes. It's been this sort of human-looking alleged bodies or pilots. Okay.
Yeah, and you know, and that kind of makes the Magenta narrative very tangential to the hybrid narrative,
and not necessarily, and nothing even in these stories it is necessarily saying.
It doesn't.
I mean, that would be conclusively non-human.
No,
in fact, the only description is that there is a human-like appearance.
Yeah,
which is interesting to me, you know, because it's just like I'm pretty well convinced that something really happened. An object, a craft, was transferred, again, bolstered by Grusch vouching for it, and all of the other evidence that we've discussed here today. But you know, you still get back to that root question of who was behind it and what were the principles at play. And you know, conversation for another day. But
yeah, and also and absolutely a conversation for just when we have some more updated information. We are absolutely in the process of getting in contact with more than just Roberto Pinotti in Italy, so that we can get this kind of granular information about the Italian side of the story, and then that will naturally lead to all of the important details about the American recovery, which I have much more about than that I haven't shared right now, because they're just ongoing leads, and it's not best practice to give all that stuff out. So,
oh yeah, for sure, yeah. So, and I find it interesting, you know, because I wonder. I'm still open-minded to any possibilities in all of these topics and all the questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder, is this something truly that was extraterrestrial or non-human? Could this have been experimental? And, you know, I made an interesting link when because there was a similar thing that happened actually in Germany. Now, Pinotti obviously has the Air Force intelligence background, more credibility. This was like a filmmaker, which has an interesting parallel to the Majestic 12 thing with the filmmaker there who received these anonymous documents. This was a German filmmaker received these documents, and this is where the root of all those stories, which I'm sure you've come across from, the information on the internet about the Vril Society and
Yes.
these things that sound very far-fetched. And I was able to find some of the primary sources on that stuff,
Really
and
interesting.
it's yeah, you can get them, and it's interesting. Like I translated it and just read it straight from the horse's mouth, and I mean, they're talking technically. They're saying in these documents that in 1930 is when this came out, and they're claiming that they're trying to make a Vril machine, and that they have facilities where scientists and financiers are working. They're saying this in this 1930 document. And when I started reading that, I thought of the Magenta case, and I was just like, I wonder if it's possible, that this was something experimental from one of these groups. And then the dot connects of, again, I asked you earlier in the episode, but we're not sure exactly where this comes from. This notion that Mussolini supposedly thought it was French or German, while Marconi thought it was something non-human. If that were to be true, right, that would imply that Mussolini saw something that didn't make him go, holy, this is totally not from here.
Right.
He
There
would
was
have
no
thought it at
smoking gun.
least possible that it was the Germans or the French,
Well, and a really interesting thing about that too is something to kind of loosely corroborate that is that, have you ever heard of the Alsos missions?
Yes, yeah, I've read
So
reports from them, yeah.
one of the most interesting conclusions to me from the Alsos missions is that Germany did not devote significant resources to the study and development of an atomic bomb. And so it absolutely begs the question of where were they diverting, what crazy projects were they diverting their resources to, actually? If they, weren't in the grounded science of making a big boom, then what kind of technology was their fringe? Because for us, the big boom was the fringe.
Right.
And that was like the frontier. But it seems like for the Germans, they had a much more base of mathematics that was much more quantum and also experimental rather than theoretical.
Right.
And so I think it's very plausible that they could have been studying propulsion mechanisms. And also something that supports that is that the only type of nuclear research that they were conducting in Germany and any sort of meaningful amount that they could find was thorium heavy water research, which I'm not a physicist, but I understand that there is some connection to some sort of propulsion research through the thorium kind of heavy water, and also just small scale nuclear reactors, which is a very interesting technology to be grasping at that time as well, because that could also be potentially propulsion related because it's just a portable power source.
Sure. Have you read Igor Wachowski, the Truth About the Wunderwaffe? I think it's worth reading, and just reading about the bell, which I'm sure you've heard of.
Yeah, I need to get some more granular information about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've actually been in touch with him, trying to clarify more stuff that he writes in the book.
Interesting.
And hear exactly where the information comes from, because it's so popular now, right? The whole Bell Project or anything. But I've tried to separate what is definitely strong evidence for what actually went down versus what's become part of the lore and zeitgeist. But a lot of that does come from it, mainly, as he says in the book, and as he told me, it mainly comes from these interrogation documents with an officer, a German officer that knew about this project that was the Bell. And so that's one clue to maybe what you're alluding to is alternative physics, highly secured, underground projects like that. And he's the only one that's uncovered anything even hinting at something tangible. We could say, oh, look here, there's a lot of other circumstantial stuff, tons of it. And I just see that there's got to be a link, as we've spoken about somewhat here today, with Italy, with the 33 crash. And, the more, as you've said, more people look into this and other topics, important topics, the more hopefully we can put the picture together. And
right. Yeah. And just to kind of throw a couple interesting data points about the wonder weapons that I know, For one, I happen to know that James Angleton specifically studied a series of claims about secret weapons specifically, and I have that document somewhere trolled away. But essentially, it's a really great list of names, claims, and instances of investigation where they absolutely were actively investigating claims of advanced technology from Nazi scientists and Nazi high officials.
I would love to check that out if you can.
It was something that they were absolutely collaborating with the research and development branch of the OSS in order to provide the expertise to interrogators to know whether or not what the people being interrogated were saying anything of value. But they also, through that, created a perfect mechanism of plausible deniability, because it was essentially just a mechanism for the claims to be reviewed by somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. And then they can say whatever and tell the interrogator, oh, that's bullshit, don't listen to that guy. But then they can go follow up in secret with the scientists if they're actually saying something they think is true.
Right.
And so it's a really kind of fascinating kind of look into what that actually looked like for the X2, the counterintelligence unit, who was trying to figure out who was talking shit and who was not. And there was also a section 19 of the OSRD that was intermingled with the OSS that was investigating claims of death rays and other advanced technologies at the time that heavily intersects with those kinds of interrogations. And another really interesting thing is that I actually just read this recently. Alan Dulles makes a stunning admission about the wonder weapons in his book about Operation Sunrise. And I was very surprised to read this, actually. Really? He essentially claims that Karl Wolff claimed to him that one of the primary reasons that the Sunrise negotiations got backed up is because Wolff got forced to Berlin to gossip with everyone about the wonder weapons that the Nazis were making. And according to Dulles, he spent the entire time in Berlin figuring out it was all nonsense. And that
that's total BS.
Well, and and it's just it's such a specific statement that like you can point to it and say, now in the modern world, like, do you trust Alan Dulles to
of course not.
To say what Karl Wolff said to him, because he's essentially the only source we have.
He's the spy master.
He's the only person that we can even take as a primary source on what Karl Wolff told him. And, here he is saying that, oh, yeah, they were all just crazy and it was all nothing. Do you believe him? Do you think he was telling the truth? Like, like that's a really, really fascinating data point to me, because he even identified that the existence of the wonder weapons was critically strategically important to him. And he was willing to acknowledge that in the public sphere in the 60s, if only to hand wave at it and say, oh, it wasn't a big deal. Right. But, he was so old school that when he does that, it's very revealing. Yeah. That's something that the old agency very much struggled with, is that when they do or don't talk about something, either a void of information or a plethora of information, they're both very useful for discerning what these people actually thought about this shit. And now, with the internet perspective, we have this bird's eye view that they weren't even thinking was going to be possible. So, that's also why I really, really like older investigations like this, because I can poke into the most sensitive details of Alan Dulles' life, and it contextualizes and makes my hypothesis just much more rich and connective to the other things that his long and storied career was connected to. Because, he truly was, talk about a Forrest Gump type figure. He pops up everywhere. Yeah. And not many people know that he had a sister too, Eleanor, that was also very involved. So just the Dulles family dynasty, just its importance to the American history physically cannot be understated. The more and more I research him, the more I come to understand that, good or bad, like him or not, if you don't understand Alan Dulles, you are factually uninformed on a critical element of American history. And and I think that, in my personal opinion, a stigmatizing strategy around UFOs would have been something in exactly Alan Dulles' playbook. He used social stigma.
Yeah. Well, people don't realize
so many occasions.
Right. People don't. One thing that might be overlooked is that Dulles is heading the CIA for a long time in the meat of the UFO subject developing. It's like first you have 47 to 50 with Hill Encoder, who we got to have another conversation about because I've dug into him pretty deeply.
I love Hill Encoder. He's such an interesting.
Then you have Smith, who was best friends with Dulles. Dulles actually wrote the report that got Hill Encoder fired. And Hill Encoder, to my research, Hill Encoder appeared decent person. He was at least open to not extreme secrecy and like corruption stuff. He wasn't perfect, because I've seen some other
cut
stuff.
Above the rest of them. That's for damn sure.
And then that takes over. Smith has it for 3 years, 50 to 53, which is another crucial UFO narrative development. And then Dulles is running the show for that whole long period.
And essentially right at the height of Blue Book, at the height of, when the MJ12 documents would have been crafted, which I think a lot of people miss out on, that like, where did the strategic positioning of MJ12 come from? Who designed that operation? Who designed the mechanisms for it to work across all the different sections of government? Who would have had the experience, the network, the wherewithal, and just the deep knowledge to do such a thing? It's a very, 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 very small list. And Alan Dulles and James Angleton are right at the tippy top.
Right.
Because the way that they can colluded on strategy constantly, making such a tight knit network between the counterintelligence and the, just normal operations of the agency was fundamentally central to their strategy. So to posit that they had no awareness of UFOs, weren't having meetings responding about the strategy of public opinion and discourse around UFOs, I think is not only factually incorrect, but ludicrous to claim, because they had to have been. They had to have been. It had to have been deeply connected to their psyche, their consciousness, what they thought about the issue.
Sure.
And so I think in UFOs, we get often too caught up on who was doing the science, blah, blah, blah. I can kind of take or leave that stuff. Show me who was making the decisions. Show me who thought it was a good idea to cover this up and then designed a system for it to happen, regardless of what scientists thought, because that's essentially what happened. I think a lot of scientists didn't really agree with the idea that it needed to be secret, but they were imposed secrecy upon them. And that's just a classic, another.
Or I mean, 95% or more of them don't even know because of the compartmentalization. It's like, you're working on this thing, make it do this. And it's like, I don't know what they're working on. Something weird. Is it a guided missile? Probably some advanced guided missile, it's like.
And then also only Alan Dulles and his group would probably do something so morally dubious as to give a bunch of scientists data and information that its provenance isn't fully humans' discoveries, so that way, if there's ever patent arguments over this shit in the future, everybody's just fucked. And I think that's kind of maybe the major reason why it still isn't out today, is because the original secrecy that they designed distributed the technology in a way that we could benefit from it, absolutely. But now it's made this landscape to where all of the most famous scientists in their work are predicated on this kind of uncertain provenance and kind of classified information. Sure. And so when the next generation of scientists goes to learn about their work, they're like, oh, wait, so I can't have all their work? And if I want to do the same level of category of work that they were doing, I have to go essentially join the military industrial complex and sign away my rights to my scientific discoveries to them. Sure. And they've been turned off by that. So they don't. And it's kind of created this huge disconnect in our society and between, academics just somehow not taking seriously the way that the military industrial complex has co-opted just the process of academic information in itself for its own use and purposes, and for the ability to have these black projects that are 20, 30, 50 years ahead potentially of our current state of technology.
Right.
And I think that it all kind of goes back to these same people who made these decisions for all of us. And that's why I focus so much on them, because I think it really does go back all to them.
Absolutely. We see obviously this goes back to 33 and why it's so interesting to me and important in my view. But, we see the big wave in 47. We see things happening around World War II. And so that's what I'm on the same page with you about, is my journey's been primarily, still taking everything up to the present day, but it's more about that original, like you said, decisions that were made. What happened early on? How was it being dealt with? and then how did it play. And I think the clearer we get on that, the clearer we can be about what's going on now, what's been going on for decades. So, and there's still a lot of work to be done. As you just alluded to,
100%.
academia has largely overlooked this. Academia in the first place is not trustworthy in a lot of ways, in my view. The more and more that I read stuff that I'm consulting primary sources on, like I told you off air, I see that scholars and authority figures are just leaving out big chunks of information, or they're slanting it a certain way, sometimes even stretching it and misrepresenting what the document actually says. So, part of, and unfortunately we're out of time here, so we're going to have to bring this thing to a close. But part of what we spoke about off air too is, great to have this conversation, hoping that more people will start doing more research and going to primary sources, going to the archives, using the internet, using the tools available now to find sources, and start with asking questions and then setting out to answer those questions. Hopefully some of this information can get released. I hope that someday you and I are talking about the documents, let's say, for example, that David Grusch gave the inspector general. Like, someday that's got to be declassified, I hope.
And also, I hope that one day we're just talking about, the day that the Magenta craft got revealed. Like, how
True.
cool would that be? Like, if that's truly the conclusion of all this, I just and that's
True.
obviously, that's maybe a little bit of a lofty, kind of goal to have in all this. But, I also think to myself, like, why not? I am absolutely just a person. I'm just some random dude just decided to do this. And the universe has been very responsive that somebody needs to do it. It needs to get done. Because it's just been very clear to me, and just the way that everything has been happening and the resources I've been getting access to, and just the way that I've been able to further my own knowledge, not just through searching, but just through expertise and people who are willing to give me, their time and energy to explain things to me that I don't have the, the academic standing background or anything to understand. It's just the kindness and love and energy that people have shown me has blown me away. And just like the community that I've entered here over all this. And it's certainly made outcomes like that feel so much more possible. Because I've spoken about this a little bit on other stuff, but we have a documentary in the works. And then I'm also kind of engaged in an academic research project to kind of codify some of this into the historical record, obtain new documents, obtain new details, and just in general push these hypotheses further. Anybody can do that. Anybody can form their own hypothesis, look at the information, and just try to figure out something for themselves. A lot of people assume that you need to be this or that. And I even thought that myself as I started posting on Reddit, but it couldn't be further from the truth. And if there's one thing I can impress upon people, is that, if you're interested in this and this fascinates you, look up some primary sources yourself. Try to figure out some connections yourself. It's really fun. It's really interesting. And it's an extremely valuable way to elevate real and important history to our public consciousness right now. We need it, So that's my spiel.
Well said. And I think it's the perfect note to end on.
Cool. Yeah. And thanks so much for having me on. This was an awesome experience and great experience for me. And just, thanks so much.
Of course. And we'll definitely do a part 2 in the future. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks.